Oasis Springs thrived on the rhythm of pumps. Deep artesian wells drew water from hidden underground reservoirs, allowing the town to ignore the fact that a merciless desert lay just beyond the walls. Silas, who lived on the extreme edge of the settlement, was the only one who never trusted this rhythm. While neighbors built pools and watered lawns, he methodically transformed his lot into a strange labyrinth of broken glass, old window frames, and sheets of polished metal. People called him the Glass Madman. His yard looked like a junkyard where hundreds of glass surfaces, set at impossible angles, glinted oddly under the scorching sun. No one understood why he was doing it, nor did they guess his intent was to harvest the very air.
Silas worked, not with the frenzy of a madman, but with the cold precision of a physicist. He understood that the desert was not empty, it was merely stingy with its moisture. Beneath the scorched surface, the ground held latent humidity, and in the air, even at the driest noon, water vapor persisted. He began assembling his primary traps, a series of glass panels angled to capture the maximum solar radiation during the day. By day, these panels would heat the trapped earth beneath them, driving moisture out of the soil. He was essentially building a thermal battery, preparing the ground to release its hidden burden when the desert temperature inevitably plummeted at night. The neighbors only saw a man stacking trash, unaware of the complex heat exchange happening beneath their feet.
The real magic, however, happened only after the sun dipped below the horizon. As the desert air cooled rapidly, the glass panels, which had been baking all day, began to radiate their stored heat outward into the cooling atmosphere. Silas had calibrated the angle of every pane so that they formed a precise dew-point trap. As the ambient temperature dropped, the water vapor in the air hit the cold, undersized surface of the outer glass layers and condensed into liquid droplets. Gravity did the rest. With a network of small, hand-carved wooden channels, Silas directed the trickling beads of water into a series of interconnected ceramic jugs buried deep in the shade of his cellar. It was a slow, silent, and invisible harvest, occurring while the town slept, completely oblivious to the cycle of life being pulled from the empty desert sky. While Silas refined his silent system, the town of Oasis Springs remained aggressively indifferent. His property had become a local landmark, but only as a cautionary tale of eccentricity. "Look at him," the shopkeeper would sneer, watching Silas carry heavy crates of sand to reinforce his foundation. "Dragging glass through the dunes like it's gold. The man has completely rotted his brain under this sun." For the townsfolk, the abundance of water from the deep wells made such labor seem not just foolish, but offensive. They saw his sweating, dirt-stained frame and felt a smug satisfaction in their own modern convenience. They had no way of knowing that the very infrastructure they mocked him for ignoring was the only thing standing between them and a thirsty death. Silas never argued. He simply kept polishing his glass. By late summer, the signs were undeniable to anyone paying attention. The deep well pumps began to strain, their rhythmic thrumming replaced by an occasional metallic screech that echoed across the dry plains. Silas noted these changes with a grim detachment. He spent his evenings observing the soil's behavior, measuring the rate at which the earth lost its moisture before the dew cycle could even begin. The ground was tightening, locking its resources away as the regional water table plummeted. While the town ignored the ominous silence of the failing equipment, Silas redoubled his efforts. He began constructing secondary refraction baffles, angled mirrors that would focus the earliest morning light on his condensation beds, ensuring the evaporation cycle reached its peak intensity exactly when the ambient air was at its most saturated state. The end of the old way of life arrived not with a roar, but with a final choked gasp from the main pump. It was a Tuesday, the air thick with the metallic tang of heat and dust. Suddenly, the constant background thrum that had defined Oasis Springs for decades ceased. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Within an hour, the town's reservoirs were empty, and the taps in every home began to wheeze and sputter, spitting out nothing but hot, dry air. Panic did not erupt immediately. There was a collective, disbelieving pause, a refusal to accept that the subterranean lifeblood of the town had simply vanished. Silas stood on his porch, watching the townspeople emerge from their houses, their faces pale, looking toward the silent pump house with a dawning, frantic comprehension. The reality of the situation hit the town by sunset. Without the central pumps, the municipal water storage proved insufficient for even a single day of normal consumption. People began to gather in the square, their voices rising from murmurs to shouts as the anger set in. Some blamed the local council, others cursed the ancient machinery, but everyone felt the same rising terror, a visceral, biological response to the sudden absence of the most essential resource. They moved with a frantic energy, carrying empty buckets to the dry wells, hoping against logic that a miracle might occur. Silas remained on his property, his silhouette framed against the darkening sky, meticulously checking the seals on his glass collectors. He knew what was coming. He had been preparing for this silence for years. The first night without water was the hardest. The town was alive with the sound of restless movement. People paced their kitchens, staring at silent taps as if sheer willpower could coax them back to life. Tension hung in the air, thicker than the dust of the surrounding desert. Silas, however, worked by the pale light of the moon. His system was fully engaged. He walked the perimeter of his glass arrays, adjusting the baffles to ensure the maximum possible surface area was exposed to the cooling night air. The first droplets began to form on the underside of his primary refraction plates. It was a rhythmic, musical sound, a soft plink, plink that promised survival. For the first time in months, the townspeople were silent, but Silas's yard was beginning to hum with the steady, life-giving drip of his harvest. Silas understood the physics of condensation better than any engineer in the town. He knew that for his harvest to be effective, he had to maintain a precise thermal differential between the air trapped under the glass and the ambient night temperature. He had layered his glass panels with specific air gaps calculated to optimize the thermal flux. The air, enriched by the humidity he had pulled from the subsurface during the day, was now being forced against the cool glass surface. He watched as the vapor transitioned from a gaseous state to liquid, adhering to the surface in tiny, brilliant beads. This was not a miracle. It was high-level thermodynamics applied to the most desperate environment on Earth. Every drop he collected was a testament to the fact that in the desert, wisdom was simply the ability to manipulate the laws of nature. While the townspeople succumbed to the lethargy of dehydration, Silas's underground cisterns were slowly filling. He had calculated the capacity of his system to match the daily consumption of 3 families. Each night, as the temperature difference reached its peak, the sweet spot of the dew point, his glass array captured nearly 40 gallons of pure, distilled water. He monitored the levels daily, marking the rise on a wooden scale he had built into the side of the main tank. It was a staggering amount given the barren environment. To an observer, his yard looked like a chaotic pile of debris, but to a student of fluid dynamics, it was a precision instrument. Silas was effectively mining the atmosphere, extracting a resource that everyone else deemed not existent. He knew, however, that keeping this secret would soon become impossible. The secret began to leak, not through words, but through the ground itself. On the morning of the 4th day, a neighbor's child searching for a lost ball wandered near the perimeter of Silas's lot. The child noticed something impossible. The soil near Silas's fence was dark and damp, and a small patch of desert shrubs had begun to turn a vibrant, shocking green. The child touched the wet sand, stunned. When the boy returned home and mentioned the miracle of the wet earth at his neighbor's house, his parents initially dismissed it as a hallucination brought on by thirst. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted.
In a town where every drop of moisture had vanished, the existence of damp earth was not just a curiosity, it was a beacon for the desperate. The rumor spread through the dehydrated town like a wildfire. It started in the cramped kitchens and moved to the shadowed porches, whispered by parched lips. The madman had water. By midday, the air in Oasis Springs felt charged with a volatile mix of hope and resentment. People were no longer just thirsty. They were beginning to show the early, dangerous signs of cognitive decline caused by extreme dehydration. The logic of the community began to fracture. Why did he have water while they suffered? The narrative shifted rapidly from he is a fool to he is a hoarder. Silas, working quietly to replace a cracked glass pane, felt the change in the atmosphere. He looked up to see a group of men standing at the edge of his property, their hollow eyes fixed not on his face, but on his water tanks. The leader of the group, a man named Miller, who once mocked Silas's junk, stepped onto the property. His movements were slow, burdened by the physical agony of the heat, but his posture was aggressive. "We know about the cisterns, Silas," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding sandpaper. "The town is dying. We don't have time for your games or your delusions." Silas remained calm, holding a heavy glass cutter in his hand. He wasn't afraid of the violence. He was mourning the loss of the peace he needed to maintain his delicate system. He looked at Miller and saw not a neighbor, but a desperate animal. Silas knew that if he let them touch the tanks without understanding the mechanics of the condensation cycle, they would shatter everything in their greed within minutes. Silas didn't back down. He gestured toward the largest glass array, a complex, tiered structure that caught the low afternoon sun. "If you break these," Silas said firmly, "the water stops forever. You think this is a hoard, but it is a process. This glass is not a container. It is a machine that pulls the very life out of the air. If you touch the seals, you ruin the pressure differential, and the condensation cycle will collapse. You are thirsty, Miller, but if you destroy my work, you are killing the only engine left in this valley. Stand back, and I will show you how to breathe with the desert instead of fighting it." His voice held a strange, calm authority that momentarily halted the group's advance, forcing them to look at the glass not as trash, but as a lifeline. Miller hesitated, the glass cutter in Silas's hand glinting in the harsh light. The sheer technical complexity of the structure, the deliberate angles, the specific glass textures, and intricate drainage channels suddenly became apparent to the men. They had expected a simple pit. Instead, they were staring at a sophisticated atmospheric harvester. Silas took a step forward, his demeanor shifting from defensive to pedagogical. "Water in the desert is not found. It is harvested from the thermal gap between day and night." He pointed to the refraction baffles. "By manipulating the surface temperature of the glass, we force the air to surrender its moisture. It is not magic, Miller. It is physics. If you want to drink, you must learn to build, not steal." The tension remained, but the mob's focus shifted from aggression to a dawning, begrudging curiosity. The transformation of the mob began with a single small request. Silas handed Miller a heavy, textured glass pane. "If you want the water, you must learn the geometry of the dew point," Silas said, his voice stripped of all malice. The men, driven by the primal need for hydration, reluctantly set down their makeshift weapons. For the next hour, they didn't speak of greed. They spoke of angles, surface tension, and the cooling properties of specific materials. Silas walked them through the process of cleaning the glass with fine abrasive sand to ensure the condensation would bead properly instead of evaporating. It was a surreal scene. The town's loudest critics were now meticulously polishing the very trash they had mocked. The survival of Oasis Springs was no longer a matter of politics, but of structural engineering. By dawn, the collective effort had yielded a result that stunned the men. Under Silas's guidance, they had repaired the secondary array, doubling the condensation surface area. As the temperature bottomed out, the system began to pulse with the soft, steady sound of falling water. Each man watched, mesmerized, as the liquid flowed through the wooden channels into the collection jugs. It was only a few gallons, barely a cup for each of them, but the psychological impact was profound. They had created something from nothing. The skepticism that had defined their lives for years evaporated, replaced by a sudden sharp clarity. They were no longer victims of a dry well. They were architects of their own survival. Silas saw the shift in their eyes, the birth of a new, sober determination.
With the first success, the mood in the town shifted from panic to frantic innovation. The men who had come to raid returned to their homes, not with water, but with a blueprint for survival. Silas provided the vision, explaining that the desert's humidity was a finite but harvestable resource. They began to strip the town of its unnecessary infrastructure. Wooden doors, shutters, and metal roofing were dismantled to build a forest of condensation towers. Silas oversaw the construction, his role evolving from an outcast to a reluctant lead engineer. They learned that the height of the towers was crucial. The higher the structure, the faster the cooling, and the more efficient the condensation. Oasis Springs was no longer a town of consumers. It was a sprawling, decentralized lab dedicated to the architecture of the dew point.
Within a week, the landscape of Oasis Springs had been irrevocably altered. What once resembled a derelict settlement now stood as a testament to human ingenuity, a forest of angular glass and metal towers that shimmered like a mirage under the relentless sun. The town had synchronized its rhythm to the cycle of the day. Mornings were spent maintaining the refraction baffles, ensuring every facet was clean and aligned for maximum exposure. Afternoons were a time of preparation, readying the collection channels as the air grew heavy with the promise of the evening drop. The silence of the desert was no longer an oppressive force. It was the backdrop for the constant, rhythmic plink of the harvest. The townspeople, once divided by petty concerns, were now united by the shared, tangible reality of the water they gathered together. As the town stabilized, the frantic energy of the initial days gave way to a sustainable routine. They were no longer fighting for every drop. They were managing a resource they had learned to cultivate. Silas often walked the perimeter of the town, observing the rows of collectors. He noted that their combined efforts were actually changing the local microclimate. The increased humidity from the collection process had allowed hardier, desert-adapted flora to begin creeping back toward the settlement's perimeter. It was a symbiotic growth. They weren't just extracting water. They were participating in the desert's own slow, intricate cycle of hydration. Oasis Springs was no longer a parasite on the deep wells of the earth, but a partner to the arid expanse that surrounded them. Years later, the architecture of Oasis Springs had become an icon of desert design. Travelers from across the scorched plains would arrive, expecting to see a ruin, only to find a thriving, glistening citadel of glass. Silas, now an elderly man, spent his days on his porch, watching the next generation learn the trade. They didn't use his original crude hand-carved channels anymore. They had engineered precision-molded polymers that captured the condensation with near-perfect efficiency. Yet the core principle remained exactly as he had taught them. The desert was not a void, but a reservoir. As Silas looked out over the shimmering horizon, he felt a profound sense of peace. He hadn't just saved a town. He had taught them that the most abundant resources are often the ones we refuse to see. Long after Silas had passed, the town of Oasis Springs remained. It had become a place of legend, whispered about in the caravan camps as the City of Dew. But the true legacy wasn't the shimmering glass towers or the thriving gardens that now anchored the settlement to the shifting sands. The legacy was the story itself. A narrative passed down through generations, told in the cool of the evening when the wind began to whistle over the dunes.
It served as a reminder that ingenuity is the child of necessity, and that even in the most unforgiving emptiness, humanity can create its own abundance. The glass towers stood as silent sentinels, forever catching the night, turning the thin, invisible breath of the desert into the lifeblood of a people who had learned, finally, how to listen to the silence. The tradition of the Dew Keepers became the highest honor a citizen of Oasis Springs could aspire to. It was not a title of nobility, but of duty. Every child was taught, almost as soon as they could walk, how to polish the glass with the fine desert-sifted sand and how to listen for the specific, high-pitched ping of the first condensation droplets, a sound that to them was synonymous with the heartbeat of their home. They understood that the glass was never truly theirs. They were merely its caretakers. Should a glass pane crack or a baffle warp, it was repaired before the sun could reach its zenith the next day. The cycle remained unbroken. In the heart of the desert, where silence once meant thirst, it now signified the patient, steady work of survival. The story of Oasis Springs eventually traveled far beyond the desert, reaching the ears of scholars and engineers in distant, water-rich lands. They came to the gates expecting to find a miracle, but instead found only people, humble, sun-hardened, and fiercely protective of their craft. When they asked to purchase the secret technology to bring it back to their own cities, the elders of the Dew Keepers simply shook their heads. They understood that the architecture was useless without the philosophy behind it. You could build the towers anywhere, but without the patient observation of the wind, the temperature, and the subtle shifting of the seasons, the glass would remain just glass. The wisdom was not in the machine, but in the integration of the soul with the environment. The desert remained a master, and they remained its attentive students, forever harvesting the dew of a hard-won peace. Decades after the travelers left, the glass towers of Oasis Springs began to take on a life of their own. Over time, the sand had acted as a natural polisher, and the accumulated dust had etched intricate, fractal-like patterns onto the surface of the primary panels. These were not random scratches, they were records of the desert's own history, the intensity of specific sunrises, the ferocity of sandstorms, and the subtle variations in humidity over half a century. The people realized that their collectors had become history books. By looking through the glass, one could read the climate of the past. The legacy was complete. The town had not only learned to survive the desert, they had learned to chronicle it. They stood as witnesses to the slow, grand breathing of the earth, their lives inextricably linked to the very environment that had once sought to claim them. The final testament to the wisdom of Silas and his descendants was not found in the grandest tower, but in the smallest detail, the water. It was never stagnant. It was always in motion, traveling from the desert sky, through the glass, down into the cool dark of the cisterns, and eventually back into the cycle of life that watered the gardens and nourished the people. The town had become a closed, perfect loop. Even in their passing, the people of Oasis Springs did not leave the desert. They dissolved back into it, just as the water they gathered returned to the air from which it came. The legacy of the glass was ultimately a lesson in humility, that in the grand design of the world, nothing is ever truly lost, and everything, even a drop of dew, is a part of an infinite returning tide. In the final reckoning, the glass towers of Oasis Springs ceased to be mere tools. They became temples of observation. The youngest generation, having never known the fear of the drought, began to use the refraction panels to map the stars. They discovered that by aligning the glass with specific celestial alignments, they could predict the rare, moisture-rich winds that traveled across the dunes from distant seas. The towers were now instruments of foresight, not just collection. The people of the desert had mastered the art of looking both at the ground to survive and at the sky to understand. The circle was closed. The once desperate settlement had become a sanctuary of quiet wisdom, proving that those who learn to thrive in the harshest conditions eventually become the true guardians of the land's secrets. The story of the glass towers eventually faded into myth, but the physical remnants remained as quiet reminders in the dunes. Archaeologists from distant, water-rich civilizations would later stumble upon the site, finding not a city, but a labyrinth of perfectly angled structures that seemed to hum in the wind. They stood baffled, unable to comprehend why these glass forms were arranged with such mathematical precision in the middle of nowhere. Yet as the sun set, a faint, rhythmic pinging began to echo against the glass, and the sand beneath the structures grew dark with moisture. The technology had survived, silent and autonomous, still performing the work that Silas had initiated centuries ago. The desert had claimed the people, but the machine, a monument to human foresight, continued to drink from the sky, a perpetual, invisible life support system for a world that had forgotten its name. Even as the structures stood as silent, automated relics, they held one final, unintended function. They were musical instruments. As the desert winds shifted, they pushed through the gaps in the angled glass, producing low harmonic resonances that traveled for miles across the dunes. To any wandering nomad who heard the sound, it wasn't just noise, it was a song of memory. They called it the Hymn of the Springs. It acted as a beacon, guiding the weary away from the perilous dry stretches and toward the areas where the condensation still pooled. The towers were no longer just gathering water, they were gathering people, continuing the work of community that Silas had begun. The engineering was precise, but the legacy it created was fundamentally human, a promise that in the vastness of the world there will always be a place where the water flows and the story of survival is whispered by the wind. One evening, drawn by the haunting melody of the glass, a solitary traveler arrived at the ruins. She was not an archaeologist or a historian, but a survivor from a distant, failing settlement. Her canteen was empty, her spirit fractured. When she reached the heart of the labyrinth, she knelt by the damp sand and caught a single, perfectly formed drop of water as it fell from a weather-beaten baffle. As she drank, she ran her fingers over the etched history on the glass panels. She couldn't read the scientific formulas, but she understood the language of survival written in the grooves. With renewed strength, she didn't just drink and leave. She gathered a handful of the fine, abrasive sand. Following an instinct she couldn't name, she began to polish a clouded pane, restoring its clarity. The cycle of the Dew Keepers had found a new steward, and the heart of the Oasis began to beat once more.